Turns out, lots of ales turn out to be fails. From disappointing shandies to working-class staples, we're here to pour one out for the beers that are no longer here. While grocery stores may offer a wide selection of domestics, imports, and craft brews, for the most part, they haven't really gotten into producing their own store-brand beers. A long time ago, though, there was Brown Derby, which was made exclusively for Safeway. Brown Derby beer dates back to 1933, when Prohibition was repealed. It was made by a California brewery that adopted a name and logo meant to associate its brew with the famous Brown Derby restaurants. The restaurant chain wasn't too thrilled about this honor, though, so the brewery had to change the packaging. It was, however, allowed to retain the name. The beer itself bounced from brewery to brewery, but remained a Safeway staple until 1988. At this time, many Safeway stores were sold to rival grocery chain Vons. The new owners weren't down with having their own generic beer brand. Rusty Cans notes that Brown Derby continued to be sold in some West Coast Safeway stores, but the brand seems to have disappeared altogether sometime during the past 3 decades. Portland, Oregon may be best known as the hipster capital of the world thanks to Portlandia, a TV series that was meant as a satire but often hit quite close to the mark.
Here you are.
Thank you.
That is a ginger-based bourbon drink infused with honey, lemon, and charred ice.
While we now picture Portland as the kind of place that has at least 3 craft breweries per block, there was one beer in particular that got the ball rolling nearly 50 years ago, Henry Weinhard's Private Reserve. Weinhard Brewing itself dates back to the 1850s, but the beer that made founder Henry Weinhard a household name was first brewed as a tribute to him in 1975. Henry's was a huge hit, seen by many Portlanders as something that paved the way for the craft beer revolution that came along a few decades later. Still, it wasn't long for the world. The Weinhard Brewery was sold to Pabst in 1979, eventually ending up in the hands of Molson Coors. Henry Weinhard's Private Reserve is among the handful of brands that the company just dropped. Unlike some of the other ones on that list, though, Henry's will definitely be missed. There was once a time when Falstaff was the other big St. Louis brew, behind only Budweiser. While Falstaff had no Clydesdales to its name, it had something equally monumental. It was known for its storage silos painted to look like giant beer cans. Standing on the border between Indiana and Illinois, these massive cans belonged to one of its malting plants and were built in the early 1900s, although they didn't acquire the snazzy paint job until later in the century. The beer itself, though, dates all the way back to 1840. By 1960, Falstaff was the nation's number 3 brand. Up through the 70s, it sponsored St. Louis Cardinals broadcasts, with the legendary sportscaster Harry Carey as pitchman. At the turn of the millennium, though, Falstaff was on its way out. Production ceased altogether in 2005. What brought this beer behemoth so low? In 1975, the brand was sold to the company that owned Pabst and Stroh's, and by 1990, it was being produced solely by Pabst. 15 years later, Falstaff was dropped, and St. Louis became a one-macro brewery town. Even the beer can silos no longer mark the Midwestern skyline, as they were demolished in 1997. Harry Carey himself died the following year, but we like to think of him kicking back and enjoying his afterlife with an ice-cold Falstaff in hand. If you're a moderate beer drinker and prefer nothing more than a trusty 6-pack to get the job done, you may have Jack's to thank for that.
Like a bottle of Mellow Jack's with a real beer taste, premium brewed from 100% natural ingredients. Do you have that? Mellow, bright, clear, and lime?
Yes, we do.
Once one of the South's favorites, Jack's claims to have been the first beer to come up with this concept in the 40s. Whether or not Jack's invented the 6-pack, it had a pretty good run regardless. The beer was brewed in Jacksonville, Florida from 1913 to 1956, but later moved to New Orleans where it merged with another Jack's beer brewed by the Jackson Brewing Company. In the 70s, it moved again after being bought by Texas's Pearl Brewery. While the Jacksonville Historical Society claims that Jack's is still being brewed in Texas, the info is a bit out of date as Pearl themselves were bought out by Pabst around the turn of the millennium. While its flagship Pearl beer eventually returned to the market on a local level, Jack's remains missing in action and presumed dead. Malt liquor isn't for everyone. Some have never been into it, while others might have been fine with it up until they played Edward 40 Hands at a high school party.
Oh, my brain is...
Even if you're mostly unacquainted with the single 40-ounce brews, you likely know some of the most popular brands, such as Mickey's or Colt 45. One that you won't see anymore, however, is Magnum, a malt liquor produced by Miller. Magnum was a malt liquor much like any other, although at 5.6% ABV, it fell somewhere on the lower end of the booziness scale in comparison to others. Despite earning such accolades from beer advocate users as not too bad and a solid, non-offensive malt liquor, Magnum 2 was recently dropped by Molson Coors. If you've ever caught a game at Wrigley Field, then you know there's no more quintessential Cubs fan experience than munching on a hot dog and sucking down an Old Style. Well, what you may not be aware of is that Old Style isn't really a Chicago beer at all. In fact, it's actually from Wisconsin, which is admittedly a better-known beer state than Illinois. Yet there was once an Illinois beer that had a far better claim to the title of true Chicago brew, the now-defunct Meister Brau.
I'm a simple guy. I like double overtime, smoky poker games, and Meister Brau. Nothing's richer, nothing's smoother. And guys like me don't need anything else.
Meister Brau was Chicago-born and brewed from 1891 through the early 70s. At one point, it sponsored many of Chicago's sports teams. It was the official beer of the White Sox as well as the Blackhawks and the Bears. The thing about Meister Brau, though, is that it never really caught on outside the Chicago area. The beer was eventually purchased by Miller, but the Milwaukee brewer declined to keep the name. Milwaukee, after all, has long held a bit of a grudge towards the larger city to the south. Instead, it did some tweaking of the recipe and eventually rebranded the beer as Miller Lite. While it has in fact returned as the official beer of the White Sox, we have to admit that Guaranteed Rate Field is no Comiskey Park, and Miller Lite's no Meister Brau. Back in the early 2000s, low-carb beers were all the rage, but the problem with many of them is that they tasted rather flat. Not flat as in lack of fizz necessarily, but just, kind of blah. Whatever brewers had done to decarb the beers removed much of the flavor as well. Miller tried to combat this by introducing a lemonade-flavored MGD 64 spinoff. Sadly, it was very short-lived. Miller Genuine Draft 64 Lemonade was introduced to the market in the summer of 2011, but by late July, it was dead in the water, a substance that some drinkers not so coincidentally compared it to in Beer Advocate reviews. While the product was intended to be a low-carb, light spin on Leinenkugel's popular Summer Shandy, also a Miller brand at the time, it just never really took off. At first, Miller planned to tweak the formula of MGD 64 Lemonade, but it wound up just dumping the product entirely. In fact, so eager was it to have the beer off its hands that the Milwaukee Business Journal reports that Miller bought up all the product still in the warehouses and made away with it somehow. While Miller did not disclose what it did with the unwanted beer, it wouldn't have been the worst thing for it to have found its way to the bottom of Lake Michigan if, in fact, this turned out to have been its fate. Yet another lemon-flavored beer that failed to survive too many seasons was National Bohemian Crab Shack Shandy. Despite what its name may imply, the beer wasn't actually flavored with Old Bay seasoning. That's too bad, as that might have gone over big with Natty Boh's core constituents in Charm City. It is, after all, widely considered to be Baltimore's beer, now and forever. Instead, Crab Shack Shandy adopted the more typical Shandy flavor profile, with plenty of citrus flavor to go along with its more classic malty beer taste. While the description makes it sound delightful, Beer Advocate users unflatteringly compared Crab Shack Shandy to Country Time Lemonade. As for why it eventually disappeared from shelves, we suspect timing may have been the predominant factor in its demise. It was introduced in the spring of 2018 and brought back again for the summer of 2019. But by the following year, well,
To avoid the loss of potentially tens of thousands of lives, we must enact an immediate stay-at-home order.
With COVID-19, product shortages, runaway inflation, and all the other myriad of ills plaguing the 2020s to date, it seems that Crab Shack Shandy may have been one more casualty of our post-pandemic world. 2018 must have been a good year for Shandy-style beers, as not only Natty Boh, but Old Style added one of these summer stalwarts to its lineup. Old Style didn't call its Cooler by the Lake a Shandy, though. Instead, the brewery opted to describe it as a Radler. Potato, potato. For those who don't know, a Shandy is a 50-50 mix of beer and lemonade, while a Radler can use any type of juice. That said, Cooler by the Lake was pretty lemonade-y. One Beer Advocate reviewer did detect notes of orange and grapefruit though, so perhaps it technically was a Radler after all. But what happened to Cooler by the Lake? Well, it's possible that it may have fallen victim to market oversaturation. After all, it was only available in the Midwest, territory already staked out by the very similar-tasting Leinenkugel Summer Shandy. Also taking into consideration that it only lasted for just those last two pre-pandemic summers, it's likely that Old Style's Radler met a similar COVID-blighted fate to that of Natty Boh's Shandy. Long before Seattle became associated with grunge, single-origin coffee, and craft beer, it was a regular blue-collar kind of place where people fished, worked the docks, and relaxed with six-packs of Olympia beer.
Olympia, it's the water and a lot more.
While it wasn't actually brewed in the Emerald City, Olympia was a product of nearby Tumwater, Washington, about an hour's drive south. The beer was first brewed in the 1890s by a German beer maker named Leopold Schmidt. Perhaps Milwaukee had hit its quota by then, and Mr. Schmidt was in the vanguard of brewing's westward expansion. At any rate, his brewery prospered for over 100 years, but shortly after the turn of the millennium was bought out by Pabst. From that point on, Olympia was brewed in California. Was is the operative word here, as that production is definitely past tense. According to a 2021 Instagram announcement, the company is putting a halt to the production of its beer to concentrate on a more profitable vodka distilling operation instead. Pete's Wicked Ale is one of those oh yeah beers. If you were old enough to drink the stuff back in its heyday, you're probably just now thinking those very words, followed by the thought that you haven't seen it in forever. Pete's Wicked is pretty much a Gen X beer, having come of age in 1986. Interestingly enough, it was the creation of a home brewer who was actually more of a wine guy until he tried brewing his own beer. While Pete's Wicked wasn't the first craft beer ever, it was one of the earliest and certainly one of the most popular back in its day. In fact, at one time, Pete's was the nation's second most popular microbrew, with Sam Adams taking the top spot. In the late 90s, the brand was sold to the Gambrinus Company. In 2000, the new owners tinkered with the formula. It's this change that led the original Pete to consider the brand officially dead, according to The Day. Despite the original brewer's disapproval, it took another decade before Gambrinus bailed on Pete's Wicked altogether. Once upon a time in the Midwest, there was no better beer for an Independence Day picnic than the patriotically named Red, White, and Blue. It was the kind of light and easy-drinking lager that would play nicely with fried chicken and potato salad. And it was also budget-priced, so it wouldn't set you back too much even if you purchased a case or two for the whole party. Appropriately enough, Red, White, and Blue was even born on the 4th of July. Specifically, it debuted on July 4th, 1899. What we don't know about Red, White, and Blue is the exact date it died. At least, not the first time around. It went away at some point, though it must have lasted into the 1990s, as On Milwaukee points out that it was the brew of choice for the naked beer slides that took place at a Milwaukee bar patronized primarily by Marquette students. While Red, White, and Blue was reborn in 2018 as a draft beer served by the Pabst Milwaukee Brewery and Taproom, this brief revival came to an end when the tavern itself, renamed the Captain Pabst Pilot House, closed at the end of 2020.